Okay, this is the second attempt for me to talk to you about evil. This page is 132. We're going to break this up. We're going to do a presentation on evil. That'll be one video. Then you'll have another presentation on possibly free will, omnipotence, and goodness, or I may split those up. But regardless, this is going to be a standalone video on evil. So the definition of evil, page 132. Critical component for you to keep in mind. Two most common misunderstandings about evil to make the problem more difficult is one, the tendency to see evil as an actual thing, an actual element of creation. And the second is the confusion between two very different kinds of evil, physical and moral. To start with, evil itself is not an actual created thing in the sense that we have an evil thing that God created evil. If we did, then the problem of evil solves itself, and that God is evil. And we have a problem there. That God can't be omnibenevolent. He can't be all loving, all good if he's actually creating evil. So, we've got to deal with the fact that evil itself is an actual twisting of good. Evil is a good thing gone bad. And it most commonly, in fact almost always, goes, perhaps every time, goes bad because there was an agent, a creature, could be a human, could be an angel, that took God's creation and twisted it to his own designs. So, where is the evil? If the evil isn't in a thing, turn about almost 8 lines up from the bottom of 132. See the line, where is the evil? It's in the will, the choice, the intent, the movement of the soul, which puts a wrong order into the physical world of things. In short, evil is when, like I said, an agent, an angel, or us, we take a created thing, which can even be ourselves, and we bend it to our will, rather than trying to unify it to God's will, and in so doing, that thing becomes evil. To give an illustration of this, Lucifer himself was at one point the greatest, most powerful of all the angels, but he thought he knew better than God, so he ended up twisting himself in such a way that he became almost ultimate evil, and consequently fell from heaven. Now you say God kicked him out. The reality is Lucifer kicked himself out because he said non serviam. I would rather lead in hell than serve in heaven. He did not want to follow God's will, and so consequently he became evil. So evil is not a thing. It's not a created thing. It is something we end up making through separating our will from God's will. Page 133, third full paragraph down. Evil is real, but it's not a real thing. It is not subjective, but it's also not a substance. Augustine properly defines evil as disordered love, disordered will, a wrong relationship, a nonconformity between our will and God's will. God didn't make it. We did. And or angels did. Okay. To really quickly give an illustration of this. There's this story, I won't tell you the author just yet, I'll tell you at the end. He wrote this creation myth called the Anu Dali. The idea was that in the Anu Dali there was a creator, his name was Iluvatar, literally means light bringer, and he ends up creating these angels to work with him. And he teaches these angels music, okay, and he gives all the different angels different parts, just like an orchestra, you know. An orchestra, you have the flute player in the woodwind section, the various woodwind players, the various string players, the various brass players, the percussion players, whatever. And they're all working together, playing different parts. When you put them all together, it creates this beautiful piece of music that no one person can make on their own. This is what Iluvatar and his Ainur, his angels, created. He gave them all different pieces of music. Now there was one Ainur in particular, Ainu. His name was Melkor. He was the most powerful. He's off playing, and in his section, he decides, hey, I can write music better than Iluvatar, so he starts playing his own notes. And the other Ainur around him are going, do we play with Iluvatar? Do we play with Melkor? So they start playing with him, so there's this group that's playing an entirely different piece of music. And if you've ever listened to two bands play two different songs simultaneously, it's very discordant. It's dissonant. So Iluvatar tries to then create a second theme to allow everyone to work together. And again, Melkor goes off the reservation, creates his own theme. Things get very dissonant. Iluvatar again creates a third theme to unite them all together. And all the time, Melkor keeps fighting against this. He keeps saying, I can write better music than you, Iluvatar. And finally, Iluvatar gets done. Says, okay, the music's done. Now there's this medieval concept called the music of the spheres. It was this notion that it was the music of the spheres that then made creation. This is the author's take on this. So that was the music of the spheres, and we have the universe. We have created universe, and we have Earth. And Iluvatar tells the Ainur, hey, go down to Earth and manage it for me. Here are my rules for managing it. Okay. Melkor goes down as well, but naturally he has his own ideas. And he goes down and proceeds to start to mess everything up. When there's lightness, there's dark. Where there's warmth, he creates ice. Okay. Where there's pleasant nature sounds, he ends up creating clashing sounds. Okay. And he can't create anything on his own. He always ends up just taking Iluvatar's creation and twisting it into something evil. Now, Melkor had a lieutenant. He had a number of different names. One of them was Gorthar the Cruel. If you are at all familiar with a very famous story from about 10, 15 years ago, you might recognize him as Sauron, the One Eye. Yeah, the author of the Anudali is J.R.R. Tolkien, and he used it as an overarching creation myth for Middle-earth for the Lord of the Rings. Now, Sauron, as you may know, he and Melkor were again twisting things to their own creation, and it was through Melkor and Sauron that we get the orcs. But they didn't actually create their own orcs, unlike what was shown in the movie. What they did is they took elves and they corrupted them. They twisted them. Iluvatar created elves. Iluvatar created men. Melkor, also known as Morgoth, and Sauron end up twisting them to their ends. Again, you cannot create anything on your own. Evil is not created on its own. All things are initially created good. When we twist them, they then become evil. So, that addressed the first confusion. The second confusion is we fail to distinguish between moral evil and physical evil. Moral evil is sin. It's when we do stuff wrong. It's when we separate ourselves from God's will. All right? Physical evil can be the direct consequence of that moral evil, but sometimes it's a secondary consequence, which we'll visit in a moment. But to look at a direct consequence, here's a simple way of looking at it. Take a person who drinks just too much. Okay, on a Friday night, they drink far too much. Now, they're feeling good at the moment, even though they know they're not supposed to be drinking too much. They continue to drink too much, and how are they feeling the next day? They are hungover. That's physical evil. That is suffering. But the reason they're suffering from physical evil is because they poisoned themselves, literally. It's a form of alcohol poisoning. And I usually talk about alcohol poisoning where it actually kills a person, but the reality is you take in too much ethanol, you're going to get poisoned. And then you suffer afterward. And God made it pretty clear. It's like, dude, take care of your bodies. Don't poison yourselves. What are you doing? But if you have 15 straight lemon shots, you are poisoning yourself. You are not taking good care of your body, and consequently, you're going to suffer. Take anyone who overeats for an extended period of time. They're going to become obese. They might have heart disease. They might end up diabetic. Same thing. Physical evil, our suffering, can be tied into our moral evil. But does it always? Remember the 3-year-old with leukemia? Did they do anything to deserve that? Does their physical evil, their suffering, is that tied into their moral evil? Did they make a choice? No. But this is where that business about solidarity comes into play. How we're all brothers and sisters in Jesus. Because our foreparents, Adam and Eve, separated themselves from God's will, we all suffer the same. I'm going to make reference to a story about how you as kids find out from your parents that they had an opportunity to inherit $10 billion, but because they screwed over their bosses 35 years ago, they didn't inherit it, and do you suffer as a result of that? If that story doesn't sound familiar, remind me, we'll talk about it during the meet. But that's more or less what happened. Adam and Eve separated themselves from God's will. They lost their protection from physical suffering, and consequently so did all of their children. And this is why a 3-year-old might get stricken with leukemia. One way to possibly do this is that there might have been no cancer. I mean, I'm not saying this is the case per se, but that's one possible way to envision this. There was no cancer before the fall. Now, a note on the fall. Page 134. It makes a difference how we interpret the story, second full paragraph, how we interpret Genesis 3, the actual fall. You can do it in a fundamental fashion. in the sense that Genesis is literal and historical, meaning it all happened 6,000 years ago or 7,000 years ago. This means the universe is 7,000 years old. There's a traditional interpretation which states that, as it's described here, historic but symbolic rather than literal. We're describing an actual event in human history, okay? But it's symbolic. We're not describing precisely what happened. For instance, it said Adam and Eve ate from the tree of knowledge, the tree that gives knowledge of good and evil. What fruit is that often associated with? Well, it's an apple. Problem. Our best guess is that this sort of thing took place in what's called the Fertile Crescent, more or less the Holy Land, somewhere between the Mediterranean Sea, perhaps reaching as far out to the Caspian Sea. Guess what? 7,000 years ago, did they have apples? They didn't exist. Not in that area, to the best of our knowledge. So it might have been pomegranate. But if you're going to say literally it was an apple, that's a problem. Apples didn't exist. The literal reality of the story is this. Adam and Eve were at some point in union with God's will, and then at some point they said, no, we know better than God, and we're going to separate ourselves. Non-serviam, I'm not going to serve. That's what Lucifer said to God. That's ultimately what Adam and Eve said to God. That's the original sin. That separated themselves from God's protection, and consequently they started to suffer as a result, and so did we, because we're all their kids. Okay, it then goes on to talk about its second piece of experiential evidence for historical time of innocence, page 135. It's more or less the argument from desire. The remainder of this section I'm going to ask you to read carefully. If you have any questions, you probably will. Bring them up on Wednesday. With that, I'm going to stop here. Now look for this video. Look for after this video to have at least one, if not two or three more videos to drop as well. That'll be due before Wednesday. See ya.